Excerpts from Chapter 9 of To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Excerpt 1.
You can just take that back, boy.
This order, given by me to Cecil Jacobs, was the beginning of a rather thin time for Jem and me. My fists were clenched, and I was ready to let fly. Atticus had promised me he would wear me out if he ever heard of me fighting any more. I was far too old and too big for such childish things, and the sooner I learned to hold in, the better off everybody would be. I soon forgot. Cecil Jacobs made me forget. He had announced in the schoolyard the day before that Scout Finch's daddy defended N-words. I denied it, but told Jem.
What did he mean saying that?
I asked. Nothing, Jem said. Ask Atticus, he'll tell you.
Do you defend N-words, Atticus?
I asked him that evening. Of course I do. Don't say N-word, Scout. That's common.
That's what everybody at school says.
From now on, it'll be everybody less one.
Well, if you don't want me to grow up talking that way, why do you send me to school?
My father looked at me mildly, amusement in his eyes. Despite our compromise, my campaign to avoid school had continued in one form or another since my first day's dose of it. The beginning of last September had brought on sinking spells, dizziness, and mild gastric complaints. I went so far as to pay a nickel for the privilege of rubbing my head against the head of Miss Rachel's cook's son, who was afflicted with a tremendous ringworm. It didn't take. But I was worrying another bone.
Do all lawyers defend black people, Atticus?
Of course they do, Scout.
Then why did Cecil say you defended N-words? He made it sound like you were running a still.
Atticus sighed. I'm simply defending a black person. His name's Tom Robinson. He lives in that little settlement beyond the town dump. He's a member of Calpurnia's church, and Cal knows his family well. She says they're clean-living folks. Scout, you aren't old enough to understand some things yet, but there's been some high talk around town to the effect that I shouldn't do much about defending this man. It's a peculiar case. It won't come to trial until summer session. John Taylor was kind enough to give us a postponement.
If you shouldn't be defending him, then why are you doing it?
For a number of reasons, said Atticus. The main one is, if I didn't, I couldn't hold up my head in town. I couldn't represent this county in the legislature. I couldn't even tell you or Jem not to do something again.
You mean if you didn't defend that man, Jem and me wouldn't have to mind you anymore?
That's about right.
Why?
Because I could never ask you to mind me again. Scout, simply by the nature of the work, every lawyer gets at least one case in his lifetime that affects him personally. This one's mine, I guess. You might hear some ugly talk about it at school, but do one thing for me, if you will. You just hold your head high and keep those fists down. No matter what anybody says to you, don't let 'em get your goat. Try fighting with your head for a change. It's a good one, even if it does resist learning.
Atticus, are we going to win it?
No, honey.
Then why?
Simply because we were licked 100 years before we started is no reason for us not to try to win, Atticus said. Come here, Scout, said Atticus. I crawled into his lap and tucked my head under his chin. He put his arms around me and rocked me gently. It's different this time, he said. This time we aren't fighting the Yankees. We're fighting our friends. But remember this, no matter how bitter things get, they're still our friends, and this is still our home. Excerpt 2. What bothers me is that she and Jem will have to absorb some ugly things pretty soon. I'm not worried about Jem keeping his head, but Scout'd just as soon jump on someone as look at him if her pride's at stake. I waited for Uncle Jack to break his promise. He still didn't. Atticus, how bad is this going to be? You haven't had too much chance to discuss it. It couldn't be worse, Jack. The only thing we've got is a black man's word against the Ewells. The evidence boils down to you did, I didn't. The jury couldn't possibly be expected to take Tom Robinson's word against the Ewells. Are you acquainted with the Ewells? Uncle Jack said yes, he remembered them. He described them to Atticus, but Atticus said, "You're a generation off. The present ones are the same, though." What are you going to do, then? Before I'm through, I intend to jar the jury a bit. I think we'll have a reasonable chance on appeal, though. I really can't tell at this stage, Jack. You know, I'd hoped to get through life without a case of this kind. But John Taylor pointed at me and said, "You're it." Let this cup pass from you, eh? Right. But do you think I could face my children otherwise? You know what's going to happen as well as I do, Jack. And I hope and pray I can get Jem and Scout through it without bitterness, and most of all without catching Macomb's usual disease. Why reasonable people go stark raving mad when anything involving a black person comes up is something I don't pretend to understand. I just hope that Jem and Scout come to me for their answers, instead of listening to the town. I hope they trust me enough. Jean Louise? My scalp jumped. I stuck my head around the corner. Sir? Go to bed. I scurried to my room and went to bed. Uncle Jack was a prince of a fellow not to let me down. But I never figured out how Atticus knew I was listening, and it was not until many years later that I realized he wanted me to hear every word he said.